Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most powerful pirate in history. Not the kind who yells, drinks rum, and immediately ruins his own career. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When most people hear the word pirate, their brain immediately opens a very specific filing cabinet. Inside, shouting men, spilled rum, dramatic accents that migrate wildly between continents, and at least one guy who definitely hasn't brushed his teeth since the Middle Ages, which for pirates is impressive because it wasn't even the Middle Ages anymore. Pirates, in popular imagination, are chaos with a hat. That image is comforting. It's cinematic. It's also completely useless for understanding how piracy actually worked. And even worse for understanding the most powerful pirate in history. Because chaos doesn't build empires. Chaos builds short careers and long lists of regrettable last words. Real piracy, the kind that survives, expands, and makes governments sweat, runs on structure, on planning, on boring things like logistics, discipline, and not stabbing your co-workers during meetings. The pirates who lived longest weren't the loudest ones. They were the ones who treated piracy less like a party and more like a very illegal shipping company. Most pirate crews were disasters waiting to happen. One unfair loot split, one captain with too much ego and too little brain, one argument fueled by warm rum and bad vibes, and suddenly half the crew is mutinying while the other half is actively falling into the sea. Pirate democracy existed, but it was less civil discussion and more everyone votes while holding a knife. Now imagine walking into that environment and saying calmly, "All right everyone, here are the rules. No random violence, no stealing from civilians, no freelancing, no emotional decision-making, no stupidity. And for breaking these rules, immediate punishment, clear, consistent, no drama." This is the moment where, in movies, the pirates laugh. In real life, they listened, because pirates didn't actually want chaos. They wanted to live. They wanted to get paid. They wanted to stop dying because their captain made another heroic but catastrophically stupid decision. Order, it turns out, is very attractive when the alternative is drowning. History struggles with this part. People prefer pirates as lovable disasters. They don't like admitting that the most powerful pirate ever wasn't wild, drunk, or reckless, but calm, organised, and frighteningly good at management. No parrots, no buried treasure, no inspirational shouting, just systems, rules, and a pirate empire that worked, which honestly is far more unsettling. Before she terrified governments, humbled navies, and turned piracy into a structured career path, Zheng Yisao lived a life so unremarkable that history barely bothered to notice her. Which, in hindsight, was a catastrophic oversight. She was born into a world that had already decided several things for her: that she would not rule, that she would not command, and that she would certainly not end up negotiating with an empire from a position of strength. Her early life did not involve swords, ships, or dramatic speeches delivered into the wind. It involved survival. Quiet, uncelebrated survival. The kind that teaches you to observe, listen, and remember who holds power in a room. At one point, she worked in a floating brothel in Canton. History loves to mention this detail, usually with a raised eyebrow and a tone that suggests it explains everything. It doesn't. What it does explain is that she spent her early years surrounded by powerful men who assumed she was invisible. And men are remarkably honest when they think no one important is listening. She learned how deals were made, how egos worked, how promises were broken, how influence flowed sideways, not downward. She learned that authority didn't always come from shouting, and that the most dangerous people were often the calmest ones in the room. When pirate captain Zheng Yi entered her life, this was not a fairy tale. It was an opportunity, a partnership, a strategic alignment. She didn't suddenly become powerful by marrying him. She gained access to ships, crews, routes, and an entire floating underworld held together by tradition and bad habits. And she watched everything. She watched how captains argued, how loot was divided, how resentment built, how violence solved problems temporarily and created new ones immediately. Most pirates saw this chaos as inevitable. She saw it as inefficient. This is the part history often skips over, because it's not exciting. There are no battles here, no explosions. Just a woman quietly absorbing information while everyone around her assumed she was background decoration. But this is where her real power was forged. Because when the moment came, and it would, she didn't need to improvise. She already knew exactly how the entire pirate world worked, and more importantly, how it didn't. When Zheng Yi entered her life, this was not a sweeping romance involving moonlit decks and whispered promises over the sea. This was a business proposal with a marriage certificate attached. And both parties understood that perfectly. Zheng Yi was already a powerful pirate commander, leading a loose confederation of fleets that cooperated when convenient and argued constantly when not. It worked. Barely. Like many pirate organizations, it survived on tradition, intimidation, and the unspoken agreement that no one would ask too many questions as long as the loot kept coming. Marrying him did not magically grant her power. Pirates were not known for progressive views on leadership. What the marriage gave her was something far more valuable: proximity. She was suddenly close to captains, lieutenants, and decision-makers. She heard arguments before they became mutinies. She saw how alliances formed and collapsed. She watched men sabotage each other while insisting everything was fine. And most importantly, she noticed patterns. She noticed that pirate loyalty was fragile, that crews followed strength, not sentiment, that captains who ruled by fear lasted longer than those who ruled by charisma, but that fear alone still wasn't enough. People needed predictability. They needed to know the rules, even if the rules were brutal. Zheng Yi ran his fleet well by pirate standards, but pirate standards are forgiving. Leadership was personal. Justice was inconsistent. Punishments depended on mood, reputation, and how loudly someone complained. Chaos was accepted as part of the lifestyle, like scurvy or poor hygiene. She did not see chaos as inevitable. She saw it as wasteful. And while Zheng Yi led battles and negotiated alliances, she quietly built relationships. She spoke with captains, listened to grievances, positioned herself not as a rival, but as a stabilizing presence. Someone who remembered agreements, someone who didn't drink before meetings, someone who didn't solve every disagreement with a blade. Pirates noticed this, even if they didn't fully understand why it mattered yet. So when Zheng Yi died suddenly, not heroically, not dramatically, but inconveniently, the pirate world braced for collapse. Conflicts that had been kept in check were expected to explode. Fleets should have splintered. Rivals should have fought for dominance. Instead, something unexpected happened. She stepped forward, calmly, prepared, already knowing who would resist and who would fall in line. And that's when piracy stopped being improvisation and became administration. When Zheng Yi died, the pirate world did what it always did when leadership disappeared. It panicked, sharpened knives, and started quietly planning betrayals. Pirate confederations were not known for smooth transitions of power. They were known for sudden accidents, suspicious disappearances, and arguments that ended with someone being thrown overboard mid-sentence. By all historical logic, this should have been the end. A powerful leader was gone. Rival captains had old grudges. Fleets had overlapping territories. Everyone wanted a bigger share of the profits, and absolutely no one wanted to take orders from anyone else, especially not a woman. Pirate culture was many things, but progressive was not one of them. So expectations were clear. The Red Flag fleet would fracture. Captains would split off. Alliances would collapse. The sea would fill with smaller, weaker pirate bands fighting each other instead of merchants. And for a brief moment, it almost happened. Captains gathered. Voices rose. Old arguments resurfaced. Everyone waited for someone to make a move. preferably a violent one. Because violence was familiar. Violence was how pirates solved problems. What no one expected was patience. Zheng Yisao did not rush forward declaring herself ruler. She did not threaten. She did not plead. She did not perform the traditional pirate ritual of shouting loudly and daring someone to challenge her. Instead, she waited. She let the tension build. She let everyone reveal exactly what they wanted. Then she started talking, quietly, individually, strategically. She reminded captains of existing agreements. She offered stability where chaos loomed. She promised predictable rules instead of arbitrary punishment. And when persuasion failed, she made it very clear that resistance would not be tolerated. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but efficiently. This was deeply unsettling to pirates. They were used to leaders who ruled through rage or charisma. She ruled through inevitability. Every option that didn't involve following her ended badly. Not immediately, which would have been exciting, but slowly, painfully, and without profit. And pirates, for all their reputation, were practical people. Within weeks, the fleets aligned. Not because they suddenly respected her, but because she made it clear that fragmentation meant extinction. Unity meant survival. And she had already done the math. The Red Flag fleet did not collapse. It reorganized. And in that moment, piracy stopped being a loose criminal lifestyle and became something far more dangerous. A centralized power with a single mind at the helm. What made Zheng Yisao truly dangerous was not violence. Plenty of pirates were violent. What set her apart was that she understood something most leaders never do. You don't need to swing a sword if everyone already knows you'll win. She did not seize power by dueling rival captains on the deck at sunrise. There were no dramatic showdowns, no speeches about destiny, no inspirational shouting into the sea breeze. Instead, she did something far more unsettling. She organized. Her first move was not punishment, it was structure. She clarified chains of command. She confirmed territories. She standardized loot distribution. Every captain knew what they were owed when they were owed it, and what happened if they tried to take more. Pirates, it turns out, behave much better when accounting becomes predictable. Then came the rules. These were not vague pirate guidelines that could be ignored if you were loud enough. These were laws, written, memorized, enforced. Stealing from civilians meant execution. Disobeying orders meant execution. Rape meant execution. No debate, no exceptions, no dramatic appeals to pirate honor. The punishment was public and immediate. This shocked everyone. Not because pirates were suddenly offended by violence, but because violence was no longer random. It was controlled, purposeful, bureaucratic. Nothing terrifies criminals more than consistency. Zheng Yisao also understood incentives. Loyalty was rewarded. Competence was promoted. Captains who delivered results kept their ships. Captains who caused chaos quietly disappeared from leadership. She did not remove them in rage. She removed them in ways that felt inevitable, like gravity, and she listened. This part is often overlooked. She listened to grievances. She adjusted strategy. She paid attention to logistics, food supply, crew morale, ship maintenance. Under her rule, piracy became less romantic adventure and more well-run maritime operation with excellent benefits and terrible HR policies. The result was immediate. Mutinies dropped. Profits increased. Ships coordinated instead of competing. Pirates stopped fighting each other and focused on everyone else, which, historically speaking, is a bad sign for everyone else. Zheng Yisao didn't conquer through fear alone. She conquered through order, and once pirates realized life under her command meant fewer stupid deaths and more money, they stopped questioning her authority entirely. She didn't need to brandish a sword. The system itself did the cutting. Once Zheng Yisao had control, the pirate world stopped looking like a collection of unruly ships and started looking like something far more alarming. An organized fleet. Not a metaphorical one. A literal, color-coded, coordinated naval force known as the Red Flag Fleet. This was not branding. This was administration. The fleet was divided by coloured flags, red being the largest and most powerful, with each squadron assigned specific routes, responsibilities, and targets. This meant pirates stopped accidentally attacking each other, which had previously been a popular pastime. It also meant that when one fleet moved, others knew about it in advance. Coordination replaced guesswork. Strategy replaced vibes. Under Zheng Yisou, piracy became synchronized. Ships didn't just wander the sea hoping to bump into merchant vessels like drunk seagulls. They patrolled. They blockaded. They controlled choke points. Entire stretches of coastline became operational zones, which is pirate for don't even think about sailing here. And it worked. Merchants rerouted trade. Ports paid protection. Villages learned which flags meant negotiation and which meant immediate compliance. The Red Flag fleet didn't need to attack constantly. Its presence alone was enough. That's the dream of every empire, to win without fighting, or at least without unnecessary fighting. What terrified governments most wasn't the number of ships. It was the discipline. Pirate fleets are supposed to collapse under pressure. They're supposed to fight among themselves. They're supposed to make mistakes. This one didn't. Orders were followed. Signals were obeyed. Retreats were organised. Captains reported up the chain instead of improvising heroic disasters. For imperial officials watching from the shore, this was deeply unsettling. They weren't dealing with criminals anymore. They were dealing with a rival power, one that didn't bother with paperwork, but understood logistics frighteningly well. And through all of this, Zheng Yisou remained distant. She didn't sail at the front waving flags. She didn't perform intimidation theatrics. She ruled from behind the scenes, issuing directives, approving plans, and letting her system do the work. The pirates didn't need to see her constantly. They felt her presence in the rules, the structure, and the consequences. By this point, piracy under Zheng Yisou wasn't a lifestyle. It was a profession, a career with benefits, and an extremely unforgiving retirement plan. Pirates are not supposed to have rules. That's kind of the brand. Rules are for governments, monasteries, and people who enjoy paperwork. Pirates, according to popular belief, are fueled entirely by impulse and poor life choices. Zheng Yisou disagreed. One of her first and most radical decisions was to introduce a formal code of laws. Not vague suggestions, not guidelines, but actual rules with clearly defined punishments. This was revolutionary. Pirates were used to captains making decisions based on mood, ego, or how recently they'd been insulted. Under her system, behaviour was no longer a gamble. The rules were brutally simple. Disobey orders, execution. Steal from civilians, execution. Rape, execution. Immediate, public, and non-negotiable. Hiding stolen goods from the communal pool? You guessed it. This was not moral reform. This was quality control. Zheng Yisou understood something crucial. Unchecked cruelty is bad for business. Random violence scares merchants into avoiding your waters entirely, which means no loot. Assaulting civilians invites retaliation from governments. Internal theft breeds resentment, mutiny, and knives in backs. Her laws were not about kindness. They were about efficiency, and pirates, surprisingly, appreciated that. Knowing exactly where the line was meant, you could operate right up to it without fear of arbitrary punishment. The rules applied to everyone, captains included. That alone was shocking. Under previous leaders, captains could get away with almost anything as long as they were feared. Under Zheng Yisou, rank did not grant immunity, it granted responsibility, which is a terrifying upgrade. Punishments were public for a reason, not theatrical, instructional. Everyone knew what happened when rules were broken. There was no confusion, no debate, no appeals to emotion. The system spoke clearly and only once. The result was immediate discipline. Pirates stopped freelancing. They stopped terrorizing villages unnecessarily. They followed orders. Loot flowed upward, was redistributed fairly, and morale improved in the deeply unsettling way that happens when criminals realize they're safer inside a system than outside it. To outside observers, this was horrifying. Governments expected pirates to implode under pressure. Instead, they became more organized the harder they were pushed. Zheng Yisao had done something no pirate leader had ever managed. She made lawlessness predictable, and predictability in the hands of someone this competent was more dangerous than chaos ever could be. The obvious explanation for why pirates followed Zheng Yisao is fear. And yes, fear played a role. The punishments were real, immediate, and memorable. But fear alone does not hold together tens of thousands of armed criminals for long. Fear creates obedience in the short term, and mutiny in the long term. What actually kept her pirates loyal was something far more effective. Life got better under her rule. Under previous pirate leaders, survival was optional. Captains made impulsive decisions. Ships fought when they didn't need to. Crews died because someone wanted to prove a point. Loot was divided unfairly, usually favouring whoever shouted loudest or stabbed first. Being a pirate meant freedom, sure. Freedom to be killed by your own side on a bad day. Zheng Yisao removed that uncertainty. Under her system, pirates knew what they would earn. They knew what behaviour would be punished. They knew which risks were worth taking, and which were pointless. This may sound dull, but dull is excellent when your workplace involves cannon fire. She also understood incentives. Competent captains were rewarded with better routes and larger shares. Crews that followed orders were protected from internal theft and random violence. Discipline didn't just prevent chaos, it made piracy profitable again. Even more important, she reduced stupid deaths. This cannot be overstated. Pirates did not romanticize dying in battle. That myth was invented later by people who never had to swab a deck. Real pirates wanted to live, eat well, and retire somewhere warm with all their limbs intact. Under Zheng Yisao, survival rates improved dramatically. Fewer unnecessary fights, more coordinated attacks, clean retreats when situations turned unfavourable. And then there was fairness. Her laws applied to everyone. Captains could not abuse crew members without consequences. Favoritism decreased. Justice became consistent, harsh but predictable. Pirates might hate rules, but they hate arbitrary authority more. So obedience wasn't forced every day. It became habitual. By the time her empire reached its height, pirates weren't following her because they were terrified of her personally. Many had never even met her. They followed the system she built, because stepping outside it meant chaos, loss, and almost certainly death. In the end, Zheng Yisao didn't rule like a tyrant shouting from the deck. She ruled like gravity, always present, impossible to argue with, and absolutely unforgiving if ignored. For a long time, governments treated piracy the way people treat bad weather. Unpleasant, annoying, and largely unavoidable. You lost a few ships, merchants complained, officials shrugged, and life went on. Pirates were criminals, not competitors. Zheng Yisao changed that calculation. Suddenly, trade routes stopped functioning normally. Merchant ships vanished or refused to sail altogether. Coastal towns learned, very quickly, that paying pirates was cheaper than trusting the navy. Entire regions of the South China Sea operated under an unspoken understanding. If the Red Flag Fleet allowed you to trade, you traded. If it didn't, you didn't. This was not a nuisance. This was economic disruption. Officials began to realize something deeply uncomfortable. They were no longer dealing with scattered criminals. They were dealing with a parallel power structure that collected revenue, enforced laws, and controlled territory. And unlike a traditional government, this one moved. Reports poured in describing pirate fleets that coordinated attacks, withdrew strategically, and returned exactly when expected. This was not how pirates were supposed to behave. Pirates were supposed to be impulsive, sloppy, predictable in their unpredictability. These ones were efficient. Imperial officials tried issuing orders. They tried increasing patrols. They tried pretending the problem wasn't that serious. That phase did not last long. Merchant losses mounted. Tax revenue declined. Local authorities began quietly negotiating on their own, because being alive and employed tomorrow was more important than loyalty to distant superiors. And then there was the humiliation factor. Navies were built to fight other navies, not criminals with better local knowledge, faster ships, and zero interest in playing fair. Every failed engagement made the situation worse. Each loss didn't just weaken the state materially, it made the pirates look legitimate by comparison. The most alarming realization was this: the pirates were not trying to overthrow the government. They weren't announcing revolutions or claiming divine authority. They were simply operating so effectively that the state's authority became optional. That's the nightmare scenario. When people stop asking whether the government can protect them and start asking whether pirates will leave them alone, legitimacy collapses quietly. No speeches, no declarations, just a shift in who people listen to. By this point, the question was no longer, how do we stop her? It was, how do we survive this without looking completely powerless? And that's when the situation moved from policing to negotiation. When negotiation failed to restore control, governments did what governments always do when embarrassed. They reached for ships, uniforms, and confidence that was not entirely deserved. The Qing Navy prepared to confront the Red Flag Fleet directly, fully expecting that once real warships arrived, the pirate problem would politely collapse. It did not. On paper, the Navy had every advantage. Larger ships, heavier guns, formal training, officers with ranks, medals, and impressive hats. What they did not have was flexibility, or any meaningful experience fighting an enemy that refused to behave like a navy. Zheng Yisao's fleets did not line up for glorious battles. They did not announce themselves. They did not stay put. They struck quickly, retreated before reinforcements arrived, and vanished into familiar coastal waters where imperial ships struggled to maneuver. When pursued, pirate vessels scattered like birds, only to regroup hours later somewhere else entirely. Naval commanders were furious. How do you defeat an enemy that refuses to stand still and insists on choosing when, where, and whether to fight? Worse still, pirate intelligence was excellent. Local fishermen, merchants, and coastal communities often warned the pirates of naval movements long before the ships arrived. Sometimes this was fear. Sometimes it was profit. Sometimes it was simple pragmatism. The pirates were closer. The Navy was distant. People made rational choices. Engagement after engagement ended the same way. The Navy would approach. The pirates would withdraw. Smaller imperial vessels were isolated and captured. Larger ships struggled to bring their firepower to bear against faster, more maneuverable targets. Every failure made the next operation harder, because morale eroded quickly when sailors realized they were fighting a smarter opponent. The psychological damage was worse than the material losses. A navy that cannot defeat pirates begins to look unnecessary. Officials noticed. Merchants noticed. Pirates definitely noticed. Each failed campaign reinforced the idea that the Red Flag Fleet was untouchable. Not invincible, but uncatchable. And there is a difference. Zheng Yisao did not need to destroy the navy. She only needed to make it ineffective. And she succeeded. By the time officials admitted the truth, the situation had reversed completely. The state was no longer suppressing piracy. It was reacting to it. And once a government is reacting instead of controlling, the battle is already lost, even if no one is ready to say it out loud yet. By this point, something deeply uncomfortable had happened. Zheng Yisao was no longer being hunted. She was being accounted for. Officials stopped asking how to destroy her fleets and started asking how to avoid provoking them. Merchant captains adjusted routes based not on weather, but on pirate schedules. Coastal towns learned which flags meant negotiation and which meant immediate compliance. This is usually the moment in history when someone quietly admits, "We may have lost control of the situation," and then pretends that was always the plan. Zheng Yisao had achieved what most rebels, pirates, and warlords never manage. She made herself unavoidable. She controlled shipping lanes. She controlled food supplies. She controlled information along the coast. And she did it without ever declaring herself a ruler or claiming a throne. There were no crowns, no proclamations, just results. This made her extremely difficult to fight. Navies can attack armies. Governments can crush rebellions. But how do you attack a system that has already woven itself into everyday life? Remove the pirates, and trade collapses. Remove the pirates, and coastal protection disappears. remove the pirates. And suddenly everyone remembers how ineffective the official navy was before all this started. At her peak, Zheng Yisao did not need to issue constant orders. The structure she built ran itself. Captains enforced rules, crews followed procedure, punishments happened automatically. Even loyalty became self-sustaining because defecting meant losing protection, income, and survival. This is the moment she became truly dangerous. Not when she had the most ships, not when she won the most battles, but when she no longer needed to prove anything. Governments realized that even if they somehow destroyed part of her fleet, the rest would continue operating. Like trying to punch fog and being surprised when your hand stays wet. She wasn't a single point of failure. She was redundancy, and perhaps most unsettling of all, she didn't seem interested in pushing further. She didn't demand territory. She didn't attempt to overthrow the empire. She simply existed, powerful enough to ruin trade, stable enough to keep it flowing, and smart enough not to overreach. This left officials with an impossible choice. Continue losing resources in a war they couldn't win, or accept that the most powerful force in their waters wasn't wearing a uniform. And once that realization settled in, the next step became inevitable: negotiation. After years of defeating navies, humiliating officials, and running the most efficient pirate organization in history, Zheng Yisao did something no pirate legend prepares you for. She stopped. Not because she was losing. Not because she was betrayed. Not because the empire suddenly found its courage. She retired. This is the moment where every pirate story usually ends in blood, betrayal, or a noose. History is very consistent about this. Pirates are not supposed to age gracefully. They are supposed to die loudly and provide moral lessons. Zheng Yisao ignored this entire tradition and chose the most rebellious act imaginable: quitting while winning. By this point, the Qing government understood something uncomfortable. They could continue fighting her indefinitely, bleeding ships, money, and credibility. Or they could accept reality and negotiate with the woman who had already beaten them in every way that mattered. So they did. Talks began, carefully, quietly, with the tone people use when negotiating with someone who absolutely does not need to agree with them. Zheng Yisao listened. She did not beg. She did not threaten. She simply made it clear that she had options, and time. Her terms were audacious: amnesty for herself and her followers, the right to keep her wealth, protection for her people from future prosecution, and recognition that this entire arrangement was, frankly, the government admitting defeat without saying the word. And here's the part that still confuses historians. The government agreed. They didn't like it. They didn't celebrate it, but they signed it. Because at that stage, the choice wasn't between victory and surrender. It was between controlled peace and endless embarrassment. For pirates who had spent their lives expecting betrayal, this was surreal. Their leader wasn't being executed. She wasn't being imprisoned. She wasn't being erased. She was being acknowledged. Zheng Yisao walked away from piracy not in chains, but with legitimacy. No dramatic last stand, no gallows, no betrayal at sea. Just a woman who looked at the situation, calculated the odds, and decided that the smartest move was to stop playing, which might be the most pirate thing she ever did. The amnesty agreement was not a mercy, it was a confession. When the Qing government accepted Zheng Yisao's terms, they weren't being generous, they were being realistic. Empires do not negotiate with criminals unless those criminals have already won, and by this point, Zheng Yisao had won so thoroughly that the state was simply choosing the least humiliating exit available. What makes this moment extraordinary isn't that she accepted amnesty. It's how much she kept. She did not surrender her wealth. She did not turn over her ships in disgrace. She did not disappear quietly into exile. Her followers were pardoned. Many were absorbed into the official navy, which is an astonishing sentence to say out loud. Pirates who had spent years humiliating imperial forces were suddenly wearing uniforms. Proof that if you can't beat someone, eventually you hire them. And Zheng Yisao herself? She walked away free, wealthy, and respected enough that no one dared touch her afterward. This was not forgiveness. This was containment. The Empire wasn't rewarding her. It was ensuring she never had a reason to return. What's remarkable is how clean the transition was. No betrayal at the last moment. No sudden arrests. No mysterious disappearance. History is full of rulers who promised mercy and delivered chains. This was not one of those stories. The government honoured the agreement because breaking it would have been dangerous. Not just militarily, but symbolically. Zheng Yisao had already proven that authority without legitimacy collapses. The state was not eager to remind everyone of that lesson again. And then, she vanished from the pirate world. No resistance. No splinter factions trying to revive her empire. No dramatic comeback. Because she dismantled her own system properly. Orders were passed. Ships reassigned. Crews dispersed. Piracy didn't explode in chaos. It faded. That alone shows how complete her control had been. This wasn't a pirate empire collapsing. It was a pirate empire closing operations. The state regained the sea, but not because it conquered her. It regained it because she allowed it to, on her terms, at her timing, when it benefited her most. Most pirates die fighting empires. Zheng Yisou forced an empire to negotiate reality, and that may be the most powerful act in the entire story. After dismantling the most powerful pirate empire in history and forcing an empire to negotiate its own embarrassment, Zheng Yisou did something truly scandalous by pirate standards. She settled down. No dramatic exile. No hidden island fortress. No endless paranoia about betrayal. She opened a gambling house, which, honestly, tracks perfectly. After years of managing pirates, running a business where people voluntarily give you money and argue about rules probably felt relaxing. Compared to commanding fleets and humiliating navies, dealing with gamblers must have seemed refreshingly predictable. She lived openly, comfortably, peacefully, and perhaps most unsettling of all, she was left alone. No one hunted her. No one tried to assassinate her. No officials showed up years later claiming the amnesty paperwork had a small technical issue. The agreement held, because everyone involved understood something very clearly. Disturbing her peace would be an unnecessary gamble. History tends to struggle with this part of her life. Chroniclers lose interest once the violence stops. There are no battles to describe, no betrayals to dramatize. Just a woman who outlived her enemies, enjoyed her wealth, and watched the world move on. And that's exactly why this ending matters. Most pirate legends are warnings. They exist to tell you what happens when you defy the state. You get caught. You get executed. Order is restored. Lesson learned. Zheng Yisao completely ruins that narrative. She defied the state, won, negotiated, retired, and lived. No moral punishment. No tragic downfall. Just competence rewarded with survival. That makes people uncomfortable. It suggests that power doesn't always belong to those with titles or uniforms. That authority can be built, not inherited. That systems matter more than bravado. And that sometimes the smartest move isn't one last glorious fight. It's knowing when to stop. In her later years, she wasn't feared as a pirate queen. She was respected as a businesswoman, a former terror of the sea who had transitioned seamlessly into civilian life, carrying with her the quiet confidence of someone who had already beaten the system once. No one questioned her past. No one tested her patience. Because everyone remembered what happened the last time she decided to organize something. History has produced many pirates. Loud pirates. Violent pirates. Charismatic pirates. Pirates who died screaming. Pirates who were betrayed. Pirates who became cautionary tales told by governments to scare people into obedience. And then there was Zheng Yisao. The reason no pirate ever matched her is not because she was more brutal. Many were worse. It's not because she was luckier. Plenty of pirates had lucky streaks. It's because she understood something that almost everyone else missed. Piracy is not about rebellion. It's about systems. Most pirates chased freedom. Zheng Yisou chased stability. Most pirates lived moment to moment. She planned years ahead. Most pirates ruled through fear alone. She ruled through structure, and fear just happened to come with it. She didn't romanticize piracy. She professionalized it. She stripped away the nonsense, the ego, the pointless violence, and replaced it with rules that worked. And because those rules worked, people followed them. Not because they were inspired, but because life under her command was simply better than the alternative. That's what makes her legacy uncomfortable. She wasn't a tragic hero crushed by authority. She wasn't a villain slain by justice. She wasn't even a revolutionary trying to change the world. She was a manager, a terrifyingly competent one. And that's why history struggles to place her neatly. She doesn't fit the moral frameworks we prefer. She proves that power doesn't always come from titles, crowns, or legitimacy. Sometimes it comes from understanding how people actually behave, and building systems around that reality instead of pretending humans are better than they are. Other pirates burned bright and disappeared. Zheng Yizhou scaled up, optimized, and exited the game on her own terms. She forced an empire to negotiate not through ideology, but through exhaustion. She didn't overthrow the system. She made it accommodate her. And then she walked away. No execution, no downfall, no moral punishment at the end of the story. Just a woman who looked at the world as it was, understood it better than everyone else involved, and used that understanding to win, which may be the most unsettling pirate story of all. The Renaissance liked to advertise itself as a rebirth, a return to light after the darkness of the Middle Ages. Marble statues emerged from ruins, paintings learned depth and emotion, and scholars spoke reverently of reason, balance, and human potential. On the surface, it looked like civilization had finally grown up. But scratch that polished veneer, and you quickly discover something far less enlightened. A world where power was fragile, paranoia was constant, and death often arrived without a blade or a battlefield. In Renaissance courts, survival depended less on bravery and more on digestion. Kings, popes, dukes, and wealthy merchants lived with the constant knowledge that their greatest threat was not an invading army, but the person pouring their wine. Politics was intimate. Rivals did not shout across fields. They shared dinners, marriages, baptisms, and bedrooms. And in such close quarters, poison was the perfect solution. Silent, discreet, deniable. And best of all, it let everyone pretend nothing violent had happened at all. This was an age obsessed with appearances. Public executions were frowned upon when the victim was powerful enough. Open murder caused scandals, vendettas, and inconvenient questions. Poison, on the other hand, preserved decorum. A man could fall ill. A woman could waste away. A rival could die naturally, while the court nodded solemnly and quietly adjusted the seating arrangement. Tragedy, after all, was far more acceptable than guilt. What made poison especially terrifying was how deeply it blended into everyday life. Medicine and murder shared ingredients, techniques, and sometimes the same practitioners. Apothecaries sold cures that could just as easily kill. Physicians prescribed compounds that walked a fine line between treatment and execution. Cosmetics promised beauty while slowly eroding health. In a culture where knowledge was expanding faster than ethics, dosage became destiny. Fear shaped behavior. Tasters sampled food. Cups were swapped mid-meal. Rings were designed with hidden compartments. Gloves, books, even holy objects were treated with suspicion. Trust was rare, and loyalty was temporary. Everyone knew someone who had taken ill unexpectedly, and everyone had theories about why. The Renaissance celebrated the human mind, but it also revealed the human appetite for control. Poison was not just a weapon, it was a philosophy. It allowed rulers to shape the future without appearing cruel. It let ambition operate behind a mask of civility, and it thrived precisely because the age believed itself too refined for brutality. This was the paradox of the Renaissance. While artists painted angels and philosophers debated virtue, power flowed through kitchens, cosmetics, and medicine chests. The era did not abandon violence. It simply learned to dissolve it, stir it gently, and serve it in a cup. Poison did not succeed in the Renaissance because people were cruel. It succeeded because people believed they were being rational. This was an age intoxicated by learning, experimentation, and the idea that nature could be mastered if studied closely enough. Alchemy blurred into chemistry, medicine overlapped with philosophy, and curiosity often ran far ahead of caution. In that environment, poison was not some shadowy art. It was a logical extension of Renaissance science. Unlike a sword or a dagger, poison required patience and planning. It demanded knowledge of plants, minerals, and bodily reactions. Arsenic, mercury, belladonna, hemlock. These were not exotic curiosities, but familiar substances discussed in scholarly texts and sold by respectable apothecaries. What mattered was not the substance itself, but the dose. The difference between a cure and a corpse could be measured in grains. This ambiguity made poison terrifyingly respectable. A physician could prescribe a compound to rebalance the humours, while quietly accelerating a patient's decline. Symptoms often mimicked common illnesses: fever, vomiting, weakness, wasting. Death came slowly, politely, and with plausible deniability. No screams, no blood. Just a body that failed, one organ at a time. Renaissance thinkers believed the body was a system governed by balance. Poison disrupted that balance, but so did disease. That overlap made accusations difficult to prove and easy to dismiss. If a rival died, was it murder or simply fate? Courts preferred not to ask. Asking meant admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability invited panic. The real danger was not ignorance, but confidence. Educated elites trusted their doctors, their cosmetics, their food, and their household remedies. They believed knowledge made them safe. In reality, it made them predictable. A man who took daily tonics could be poisoned gradually. A woman who applied beauty treatments could be exposed over months. Familiar routines became perfect delivery systems. Meanwhile, protective measures only increased paranoia. Food tasters reduced risk but did not eliminate it. A delayed toxin could outweight them. Swapping cups mid-meal became common, which simply spread suspicion instead of safety. The court became a laboratory of mistrust, where everyone observed everyone else, searching for signs of guilt in coughing fits and pale skin. Poison thrived because it fit the Renaissance worldview. It was subtle, intellectual, and efficient. It rewarded foresight rather than strength. And most importantly, it allowed people to believe that death, when it came, was still part of the natural order, even when it had been carefully measured, mixed, and served by human hands. If poison was the weapon, the court was the perfect terrain. Renaissance courts were dense ecosystems of ambition, envy, and forced proximity. Everyone watched everyone else, because everyone depended on everyone else. For favours, protection, marriages, and survival. You could not simply avoid your enemies. You dined with them, prayed beside them, and smiled as they congratulated you on your good health. These courts were not large by modern standards. Power clustered tightly around a ruler, and access mattered more than armies. A whispered word in the right ear could outweigh 1,000 soldiers. That closeness made direct violence awkward. Stabbing a rival in a corridor raised too many questions. Poison solved that problem elegantly. It worked best in places where trust was mandatory and privacy non-existent. Meals were social rituals and political theatre. Who sat where, who was served first, who poured the wine, every detail carried meaning. These were also the moments of greatest vulnerability. Food passed through many hands before reaching the table, each step an opportunity. Kitchens were busy, hierarchical spaces, filled with servants who could be bribed, threatened, or quietly replaced. A single altered dish could reshape the future of a state, but poison did not always come from below. Often, it moved laterally or downward. Family members, spouses, siblings, even children became suspects. Dynastic politics made relatives dangerous. An inconvenient heir, a fertile wife, or a rival cousin represented instability. Removing them quietly preserved appearances and prevented open conflict. Grief could be displayed. Questions could be discouraged. The psychological effect was corrosive. Courtiers learned to read bodies obsessively. A cough became suspicious. Weight loss sparked rumours. Sudden fatigue invited speculation. Illness was no longer private. It was political information. A dying man could trigger a scramble for influence long before his death, making poisoning both a cause and a catalyst for chaos. Ironically, the more refined a court became, the more lethal it grew. Manners replaced armour. Silk replaced steel. Yet violence did not disappear. It simply adapted. Power flowed through cups, gloves, powders, and perfumes. Assassination no longer required strength or courage, only access and timing. In this environment, poison was not just a method of killing. It was a language, a way to negotiate succession, settle disputes, and remind everyone present that survival depended on discretion. The court was not a place of safety. It was a hunting ground, quiet, elegant, and always watching for the moment when a rival grew just weak enough to fall. Poison did not always arrive in a cup. Sometimes it was brushed onto the skin, dabbed behind the ears, or dusted across the face in the name of beauty. The Renaissance obsession with appearance created an unexpected pathway to death, one that moved slowly, quietly, and almost lovingly. Cosmetics were not merely decorative. They were chemical experiments worn daily, and women bore the greatest risk. Pale skin was fashionable. It signaled wealth, leisure, and separation from outdoor labour. To achieve it, women applied powders and creams containing lead, mercury, and arsenic. These substances worked, temporarily. Faces looked smooth and luminous, but beneath the surface, the body was absorbing toxins that damaged organs, weakened immunity, and slowly erased vitality. Beauty, quite literally, was poisoning them. What made this especially dangerous was intention. Not all cosmetic poisoning was accidental. Beauty routines were private, repetitive, and trusted. A maid prepared creams, a confidant gifted powders, a husband encouraged treatments. Small alterations went unnoticed. Symptoms appeared gradually. Headaches, hair loss, tremors, fatigue. Nothing dramatic, nothing provable, just a body quietly failing. Women at court lived under intense scrutiny. Fertility, loyalty, and obedience mattered more than longevity. A woman who could no longer bear children or whose health declined could be replaced. Poison through cosmetics offered a solution that preserved dignity. No scandal, no accusation. Simply delicate health, followed by mourning and remarriage. Men were not immune, but they were less exposed. Their power was public, their routines shared. Women's power, when it existed, operated in domestic and intimate spaces. The very spaces where poison worked best. Bedrooms, dressing rooms, bath chambers. These were arenas of influence, but also of vulnerability. Medical advice only worsened the problem. Physicians prescribed treatments that compounded toxicity. A rash meant more ointment. Fatigue meant tonics. Each remedy added another layer of damage. Because knowledge was incomplete but confidence was high, harm continued under the banner of care. Poison in this form blurred moral boundaries. Was it murder if the victim applied it themselves? Was it cruelty if everyone believed it was beauty? Responsibility dissolved into routine. Death became nobody's fault. In the Renaissance, power did not always kill quickly. Sometimes it waited, sometimes it smiled, admired a woman's pale complexion, and praised her elegance, all while knowing the cost would be paid slowly, quietly, and without witnesses. In the Renaissance, the people most trusted to preserve life were often the ones best equipped to end it. Apothecaries and physicians occupied a strange position in society, educated, respected, and dangerously powerful. They understood substances most people feared, and they operated behind a veil of Latin terminology and professional authority. When poison entered the body disguised as medicine, suspicion rarely followed. Apothecaries stocked shelves with roots, resins, minerals, and powders sourced from across Europe and beyond. Many of these ingredients were inherently toxic. Arsenic was common. Mercury was fashionable. Opium soothed pain, but dulled judgment. Belladonna relaxed muscles, but stopped hearts. What separated cure from catastrophe was measurement, and measurement was entirely in human hands. Physicians were trained to believe they were restoring balance, not preventing death. Renaissance medicine revolved around humours, temperaments, and cosmic influences. If a patient worsened, it was often blamed on fate, imbalance, or divine will, not treatment. This belief system created perfect cover. A poisoned patient did not look murdered, they looked misdiagnosed. The relationship between patient and doctor was deeply unequal. Elite patients trusted their physicians implicitly, especially when illness threatened their position or legacy. A ruler weakened by sickness became vulnerable. A doctor who accelerated that decline could reshape succession without drawing a blade, and because physicians moved freely between households, their access was unrivaled. Apothecaries, meanwhile, operated at the intersection of commerce and secrecy. They prepared compounds privately, recorded recipes selectively, and answered only to their patrons. A slight alteration in preparation could change everything. Too much of an ingredient, prepared too frequently, delivered over weeks instead of days. This was death by protocol. Not all practitioners were malicious. Many believed they were helping, but the system rewarded discretion over accountability. Autopsies were rare. Toxicology did not exist. If a body failed, explanations followed conveniently. Weak constitution, melancholy, bad air. This environment bred fear and cynicism. Powerful figures employed multiple physicians, comparing prescriptions and watching for contradictions. Some rotated doctors regularly. Others took preventative antidotes daily, poisoning themselves lightly in the hope of building tolerance. Survival became a medical arms race. In the Renaissance, medicine and murder were not opposites. They were neighbours. And sometimes they shared the same prescription pad. As poison became an accepted political reality, survival strategies evolved alongside it. Renaissance elites did not sit passively, waiting for death to arrive in a cup. They armed themselves with countermeasures, antidotes, tasters, rituals, and habits designed to create the comforting impression of control. The key word, unfortunately, was impression. Food tasters were the most visible defense. A trusted servant sampled dishes before they reached the table, performing loyalty with every bite. But poison adapted easily. Some toxins acted slowly, others accumulated. A taster might survive the first spoonful, while the intended victim consumed a full portion over weeks. Protection became theatre, reassuring but incomplete. Antidotes were another obsession. The most famous was theriac, a complex compound containing dozens of ingredients, including opium, herbs, spices, and sometimes snake flesh. It promised protection against almost everything: poison, plague, corruption of the humours. It was expensive, rare, and often ineffective. Yet rulers consumed it religiously, believing that complexity equaled power. If poison was sophisticated, the cure had to be more so. Some elites practiced controlled poisoning. They ingested tiny amounts of toxins regularly, hoping to build tolerance. The logic made sense in theory. In practice, it damaged organs, weakened bodies, and shortened lives. But it offered psychological comfort, which in Renaissance politics was often worth more than health. Behaviour changed too. Cups were swapped mid-meal. Food was shared publicly to demonstrate trust. Dishes were simplified. Spices were viewed with suspicion because they masked flavours. Even hospitality became dangerous. Accepting gifts of food or drink carried risk. Declining them carried insult. Every interaction became a calculation. Paranoia reshaped daily life. Illness prompted investigations. Servants were interrogated. Physicians were dismissed. Kitchens were reorganized. And still, deaths occurred. Because poison thrived not on ignorance, but on routine. The more systems people built to defend themselves, the more predictable their behavior became. The greatest illusion was that knowledge equaled safety. Renaissance elites believed that education, science, and preparation made them immune. In reality, poison succeeded because it respected none of those boundaries. It exploited trust, habit, and the human need to believe we are in control. Antidotes did not eliminate fear, they institutionalized it. They turned survival into a daily ritual, one swallow at a time, while reminding everyone at the table that civilization, for all its learning and refinement, was still fragile enough to be undone by a single measured dose. By the late Renaissance, poison had become so embedded in political thinking that nearly every important death inspired suspicion. When a powerful figure fell ill, the question was no longer if poison was involved, but who had administered it, and whether they had been clever enough to get away with it. Illness itself became circumstantial evidence. Symptoms were scrutinized like court documents. Sudden vomiting suggested one substance. Lingering weakness suggested another. A ruler who declined over months was said to have been worked on, while one who died quickly had been sloppy poisoned. These were not medical diagnoses, they were political interpretations. Facts mattered less than usefulness. What made poison so attractive was not just effectiveness, but ambiguity. A death blamed on poison could never be fully proven, which meant it could never be fully punished. Accusations floated freely, often weaponized after the fact. If a succession went poorly, poison had surely been involved. If a rival family rose too fast, someone must have cheated nature. Convenient illnesses solved difficult problems. A sickly heir justified bypassing succession. A dying spouse cleared the path for a more strategic marriage. A fading pope created opportunities long before the conclave convened. Poison did not merely remove people, it reordered time, accelerating outcomes that might otherwise take years. Publicly, decorum was maintained. Funerals were solemn. Eulogies praised virtue and divine will. Privately, everyone understood the subtext. The dead were mourned carefully, because saying the wrong thing could mark you as either complicit or next. Silence became a survival skill. Even when poison was suspected, pursuing justice was dangerous. Accusing the wrong person invited retaliation. Accusing the right one required proof that did not exist. Better to let rumours circulate quietly, damaging reputations without triggering violence. In this way, poison continued to act long after the victim was buried. The Renaissance liked to believe it had moved beyond medieval brutality. In truth, it had perfected something colder. Death no longer needed spectacle. It needed timing, patience, and a believable story. Illness provided that story, respectable, familiar, and endlessly flexible. By the end of the era, poison was no longer shocking. It was expected. And that expectation may have been its greatest success. An entire political culture trained to accept that power changed hands not only through war or law, but through bodies that simply failed at the most convenient moment. Poison did not end its work when the victim died. In many ways, that was when its influence truly began. Long after bodies were buried, poison lingered as rumour, accusation, and reputation. It reshaped how people were remembered, how families were judged, and how history itself was written. In the Renaissance, death by poison was not just an end, it was a narrative weapon. Because proof was nearly impossible, memory became malleable. A ruler who governed harshly was remembered as a poisoner. A family that rose too quickly acquired a toxic reputation. Women in particular were vulnerable to these accusations. Intelligence, ambition, or influence could be reframed as cunning and chemical cruelty. Poison was the perfect explanation for power that made others uncomfortable. Fear encouraged exaggeration. A single suspected poisoning could taint generations. Marriage negotiations were affected. Alliances reconsidered. Even physicians associated with suspicious deaths carried invisible stains. Reputation became a form of inheritance, passed down like property, except harder to escape. This atmosphere warped behaviour. People performed innocence aggressively. Public piety increased. Charity became strategic. Bodies were displayed longer. Deathbeds were staged to look natural, dignified, and well attended. A peaceful passing was political theatre, designed to deny rumours before they formed. Ironically, the more poison was feared, the more it was imagined. Not every illness was murder. Not every death was deliberate. Renaissance medicine was crude, sanitation was poor, and life expectancy was low. But poison provided a story that satisfied emotional needs. It gave meaning to loss. It assigned blame. It restored a sense of order in a world where mortality felt arbitrary. The afterlife of poison also affected law. Courts hesitated to prosecute suspected poisoners because failure meant public embarrassment. Success meant destabilizing powerful families. Silence remained the safest option. This reluctance reinforced poison's appeal, a crime that reshaped power while avoiding consequences. In the end, poison became a mirror. It reflected the anxieties of an age caught between faith and science, brutality and refinement. The Renaissance wanted to believe it had civilized violence. Poison proved that violence had simply learned better manners, and that fear, once introduced into a society, could survive far longer than any toxin in the bloodstream. The Renaissance eventually ended, but poison did not retire with it. What faded was not the method, but the mindset that made it seem acceptable, even sophisticated. Poison thrived in a world obsessed with control, appearance, and plausible deniability, and those values did not disappear when art styles changed or scientific language improved. What the Renaissance perfected was not chemistry, but discretion. It taught later generations that power could be exercised invisibly. That influence could be maintained without spectacle. That violence could be clean, quiet, and framed as nature doing its work. In this sense, poison was less a weapon than a lesson, one absorbed deeply by political culture. As forensic science slowly developed, poison lost some of its mystery. Autopsies became more common, chemical detection improved. But by then the principle had already migrated. Political assassination learned new forms: staged illnesses, medical negligence, administrative accidents. The Renaissance had demonstrated that killing was only one part of the act. Shaping the story mattered more. There is also a darker legacy in how medicine is remembered. The era blurred healing and harm so thoroughly that suspicion lingered long after practices improved. Trust in doctors became conditional. Treatments were questioned. Authority was no longer absolute. That skepticism, born in fear, eventually became a foundation for modern medical ethics. Proof that paranoia sometimes produces progress. Perhaps the most enduring consequence was psychological. Renaissance poison culture trained elites to think defensively, to assume betrayal, to equate intimacy with danger. That mindset calcified into institutions, protocols, and habits that still echo today. Security systems, food testing, medical oversight, all trace part of their lineage to an age that learned how vulnerable power truly was. The Renaissance celebrated humanity's potential. Poison exposed humanity's limits. It revealed how easily knowledge bends toward domination, how refinement does not eliminate cruelty, only disguises it. For every masterpiece painted, there was a quiet death no one dared explain. In the end, poison's greatest achievement was not the bodies it destroyed, but the trust it dissolved. And once trust is gone, no era, no matter how enlightened it believes itself to be, can ever fully escape the fear that someone, somewhere is still stirring something into the cup. Roman baths were not built simply to clean bodies. That was the excuse. The real purpose was far more ambitious: to organize Roman society without walls, speeches, or laws. In a city bursting with people, noise, ambition, and anxiety, the bathhouse became a pressure valve. Dirt came off the skin, yes, but so did pretense, secrecy, and sometimes restraint. Rome was crowded, hot, and relentlessly public. Most people lived in cramped apartments with no private water supply. Washing at home was inconvenient at best, impossible at worst. The baths solved that problem, but they also created something new, a daily ritual that pulled citizens out of their homes and into a shared space where everyone could be observed. This was hygiene as social engineering. Inside the baths, the boundaries of daily life loosened. Senators soaked beside shopkeepers. Retired soldiers shared benches with poets. Freedmen and elites passed within inches of each other, naked and sweating under the same vaulted ceilings. Clothing, the clearest marker of status, was stripped away at the door. What remained was the body, and Romans judged bodies mercilessly. Scars told stories. Softness suggested indulgence. Strength implied discipline. The baths, were a silent audit. This apparent equality was deceptive. Rome never truly forgot hierarchy. Wealthy patrons arrived with slaves to carry oils, towels, and spare sandals. Poorer citizens came alone, borrowing what they could or making do without. Everyone entered naked, but not everyone entered with the same confidence. The baths blurred class lines just enough to create tension, and tension fueled conversation. That conversation was the real currency. The baths were where news travelled fastest. Political rumours circulated between steam clouds. Business deals were floated casually. Personal rivalries sharpened. If you wanted to know who was rising, who was sick, who was bankrupt, or who was sleeping with whom, you listened in the baths. Silence there was suspicious. The state understood this power. Emperors funded massive bath complexes, not out of generosity, but strategy. A well-bathed population was calmer, healthier, and easier to manage. More importantly, it was distracted. As long as the water was hot and the marble gleamed, complaints softened. Roman baths were not an escape from society. They were society. Condensed, exposed, and constantly talking. A Roman bath was not a random collection of pools. It was a carefully designed experience, meant to guide bodies and behaviour with subtle efficiency. From the moment you stepped inside, architecture took control. Doors, corridors, and temperature shifts directed movement like an unspoken script. You didn't wander the baths. You followed them. The sequence was deliberate. Warm rooms prepared the body. Hot rooms pushed it to sweat. And cold plunges shocked it back to alertness. This progression wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about rhythm. Romans believed discipline came from routine, and the bathhouse trained that discipline daily. The body learned obedience through heat and cold, surrendering comfort in stages. These spaces were engineered for visibility. High ceilings amplified sound. Steam blurred faces but carried voices. Benches and pools forced proximity. You could not hide easily, and that was the point. The baths encouraged lingering, loitering, and observation. If the forum was where Rome argued publicly, the baths were where Rome watched privately. Movement through the bath mirrored Roman life. You entered together, progressed together, and exited together. Even the timing mattered. Certain hours attracted specific crowds, politicians early, labourers later, social climbers whenever they thought someone important might appear. The baths became predictable, and predictability made them useful. Luxury was also intentional. Marble floors, painted walls, and sculpted statues reminded bathers of imperial power. Even while naked and vulnerable, you were surrounded by symbols of order and control. The message was subtle but constant. Rome provides. Rome organizes. Rome is eternal. Cleanliness became propaganda. Yet comfort came with pressure. The longer you stayed, the more exposed you became, physically and socially. Conversations started casually, then deepened. Alliances formed. Enemies noted weaknesses. The bath's layout trapped people in shared time, forcing interaction without confrontation. Even the exits mattered. Leaving together invited continued discussion. Leaving alone invited speculation. The bathhouse extended beyond its walls, shaping encounters on streets and in homes. The Roman bath was not architecture for hygiene, it was architecture for habit. And habit, in Rome, was one of the strongest tools of control. For all its talk of shared citizenship, Rome never stopped measuring people. The bathhouse, stripped of clothing and titles, simply found new ways to rank everyone. In a space where everyone was naked, the body itself became the resume. Every scar, muscle, wrinkle, and softness was read like a public document. A soldier's body told one story. Calloused hands, old wounds, and a posture trained by discipline spoke of service and endurance. A labourer's body told another. Strong, worn, and efficient, shaped by repetition rather than glory. An elite man's body was expected to appear controlled, but not worked. Too soft suggested excess. Too muscular suggested manual labour. Roman ideals lived in narrow margins. Status followed people into the baths in less subtle ways as well. Wealthy patrons arrived with attendants who carried oil flasks, towels, sandals, and strigils. These slaves hovered nearby, scraping sweat, applying scented oils, and guarding belongings. Their presence announced rank more loudly than any ring or toga. Poorer bathers brought nothing but themselves, borrowing tools or scraping dry with bare hands. Even the way one bathed signalled class. Expensive oils smelled of distant provinces and careful trade. Cheap oils smelled sharp and local. Some bathers lingered comfortably, owning the space. Others washed quickly and left, aware that prolonged visibility invited judgment. Women's baths followed similar patterns, though sources speak more quietly about them. Female bodies were scrutinized just as closely, and reputation mattered even more. A woman's presence, posture, and companions could spark gossip before she ever spoke. Privacy was limited, interpretation was not. The baths also offered opportunities to perform status. Conversations were carefully chosen. Names were dropped casually. Compliments disguised alliances. Silence signalled either confidence or danger. Everyone learned to read these cues early, because misreading them could be costly. Yet the baths never fully flattened hierarchy. They teased equality without delivering it. That tension was the point. Rome allowed just enough mingling to keep ambition alive, just enough visibility to remind everyone where they stood. In the steam and sweat, status did not disappear. It adapted, and in doing so, the bathhouse became one of Rome's most efficient classrooms, teaching citizens, every day, exactly how much they were worth in the eyes of others. If Rome had a bloodstream, gossip was the fluid, and the baths were where it circulated fastest. Steam loosened tongues as effectively as it loosened muscles. Conversations began lightly, about aches, weather, or the temperature of the water, but they rarely stayed there. In a place where privacy was impossible and silence felt suspicious, talk became both shield and weapon. The baths gathered people who would otherwise never linger together. That proximity created opportunity. News from the forum drifted in before official announcements. A senator's illness was discussed while he still lived. A merchant's bankruptcy was known before his creditors arrived. Affairs, betrayals, promotions, and demotions all surfaced here first, wrapped in casual phrasing and half smiles. Gossip thrived because it was useful. Information in Rome was currency, and the baths were an exchange market. Listening mattered as much as speaking. Knowing when to repeat a rumour, and when not to, could advance a career or destroy it. The wrong comment overheard by the wrong person could echo far beyond the marble walls. The setting encouraged this. Steam blurred faces, but carried voices. You might not see who was listening, which made every sentence risky. People learned to speak indirectly, to hint rather than accuse. Phrases like, "I've heard," or "they say," protected the speaker while letting the rumour do its work. Responsibility dissolved into atmosphere. Political gossip was especially dangerous. Emperors might appear generous in public, but criticism in the baths travelled fast. That did not mean people were careless. It meant they were strategic. Complaints were framed as concern. Praise was exaggerated just enough to sound ironic. Everyone understood the game, even when pretending not to. Personal lives were not spared. The baths exposed bodies, and bodies inspired stories. Weight gain suggested indulgence. Sudden thinness suggested illness or stress. Marks on skin prompted speculation. Nothing went unnoticed, and everything was interpreted. The result was a strange intimacy. You could know everything about a man's reputation without ever speaking to him directly. The baths created familiarity without friendship, knowledge without trust. Rome valued order, but gossip thrived in its cracks. And in the warm, echoing chambers of the baths, those cracks widened, whispered into steam, carried outward, and released into the city, where reputations rose and fell long before anyone dried off. The Roman bathhouse was never politically neutral. It only pretended to be. Beneath the marble and steam, power moved quietly, testing loyalties and measuring ambition. The baths offered something rare in Roman life: access. Not formal access, guarded by doors and titles, but accidental access. The kind that happened when two naked men found themselves sharing a bench, equally exposed, equally damp. Politicians understood this advantage well. The conversation in the forum was public and performative. The conversation in the baths felt casual, almost harmless. That illusion made it dangerous. Deals were hinted at, rather than declared. Support was suggested, not promised. A nod, a shared complaint, a moment of agreement in the heat could signal more than a speech ever would. Timing mattered. Arriving early might mean running into senators and magistrates before their day hardened them into caution. Arriving later meant encountering businessmen, contractors, and local power brokers. The baths became a rotating map of Roman influence, and skilled men learned exactly when to appear. Even emperors participated, carefully. When a ruler bathed publicly, it was a calculated display of confidence and accessibility. He showed that he did not fear assassination or insult. But this closeness came with risk. Every word spoken near an emperor could be remembered. Every reaction could be interpreted. Presence itself was political performance. For those below the top, the baths offered opportunity. A well-placed comment could attract patronage. A show of loyalty could be noticed. A display of restraint could mark someone as trustworthy. Advancement in Rome often depended less on merit than visibility, and the baths offered daily exposure. But danger lurked here too. Saying the wrong thing, or being overheard, could end a career. Jokes about leadership travelled faster than apologies. Political enemies listened closely, storing grievances for later use. The baths rewarded intelligence but punished carelessness. In this way, Roman politics seeped into the water. The baths softened bodies but sharpened minds. They trained citizens to navigate power subtly, to speak without committing, to listen without reacting. By the time bathers dried off and dressed again, decisions had already been shaped. Alliances had warmed, rivalries had cooled or intensified. The real work of Rome often happened not in marble halls or crowded forums, but between the pools where ambition floated quietly, waiting for the right moment to surface. For a society obsessed with order and reputation, Roman baths were surprisingly intimate places. Bodies were on display, boundaries were softened by heat, and the usual barriers of clothing and distance simply did not exist. This did not turn the baths into chaos, but it did turn them into spaces charged with possibility. Nudity in Rome was not automatically sexual, but it was never meaningless. The way someone stood, moved, or made eye contact mattered. Confidence attracted attention. Awkwardness invited judgment. The baths allowed people to observe one another in a raw, unfiltered state, and that closeness inevitably produced desire, curiosity, and speculation. Flirtation in the baths was subtle. Open advances risked scandal, but signals were everywhere. Lingering glances, conversations that lasted just a bit too long, compliments framed as jokes, invitations to continue a discussion elsewhere. Because everything happened in public, discretion became part of the appeal. Being noticed without being exposed was a skill. These dynamics applied across genders and social lines. While many baths were segregated by time or space, overlap occurred, and rumours flourished. Even within single-gender spaces, desire did not disappear. Roman attitudes towards sexuality were complex, hierarchical, and deeply tied to power. Who desired whom mattered less than who held control in the interaction. The baths offered plausible deniability. Encounters could be framed as accidental. Conversations could be dismissed as harmless. Physical proximity could be blamed on crowded benches. This ambiguity protected reputations while allowing connections to form. At the same time, the baths amplified scrutiny. Being seen too often with the same person raised questions. Absence invited its own rumours. Desire became another form of social currency, one that could elevate or destroy depending on how carefully it was handled. What made the baths unique was not that Romans desired one another, they always had, but that desire unfolded under constant observation. Privacy was replaced by performance. Intimacy became something navigated rather than hidden. In this environment, The baths trained Romans to manage not only politics and reputation, but attraction itself, to feel without revealing too much, to engage without committing, to leave before anything became undeniable. The water washed the body clean, but it also stripped away excuses. And when Romans left the baths, wrapped again in cloth and status, they carried with them the quiet awareness that everyone had seen and remembered far more than they pretended. For all their marble, steam, and ritual, Roman baths were not nearly as hygienic as Romans liked to believe. The illusion of cleanliness was powerful, but it rested on fragile foundations. Water was reused, pools were crowded, oils, sweat, dirt, and bodily residue floated together, stirred constantly by human movement. The baths cleansed the senses more effectively than the body. Romans did not use soap in the modern sense. Instead, they coated themselves in oil and scraped it off with a strigil, removing dirt along with the oil. This method worked, up to a point, but the scraped mixture often ended up on the floor, the walls, or back into shared water. What left one body often found another. The popularity of the baths made them ideal environments for spreading illness. Skin conditions, eye infections, parasites, and fevers passed easily through shared spaces and tools. Towels were reused, benches stayed warm and damp, pools circulated people more efficiently than water, yet outbreaks rarely led to reform. The baths were too important socially to abandon. Romans understood disease imperfectly. Illness was blamed on bad air, imbalance, or fate rather than contamination. If someone fell sick after bathing, it was unfortunate but not incriminating. The baths themselves were rarely questioned. Cleanliness was associated with virtue, so the idea that a bathhouse could cause harm was uncomfortable. This contradiction reveals something essential about Roman priorities. The baths were not designed for health first. They were designed for cohesion. They kept citizens engaged, visible, and occupied. A slightly sick population was preferable to a restless one. As long as the baths functioned, complaints softened. Even emperors tolerated the risks. Closing baths meant unrest. Limiting access meant resentment. The water could be murky, but the political cost of draining it was higher. Despite this, Romans remained deeply attached to the idea that they were cleaner, more civilized, and more advanced than others. The baths symbolized that belief. To question them was to question Roman identity itself. In the end, Roman baths reveal a familiar human pattern. People will tolerate discomfort, risk, and even harm if the system gives them belonging. Cleanliness mattered, but belonging mattered more. And so the baths continued, crowded and imperfect, washing Rome not into health, but into something far more important: a shared sense of being Roman. Not everyone admired the Roman baths. In fact, some Romans worried that the baths were doing more than softening muscles. They were softening morals. Philosophers, moralists, and traditionalists complained that too much time in warm water led to laziness, indulgence, and a dangerous obsession with pleasure. The bathhouse, in their view, was not just a social hub, but a breeding ground for excess. These critics believed hardship built character. Cold water, restraint, and discipline were praised as old Roman virtues. The baths, with their heated rooms, scented oils, and leisurely pace, seemed suspiciously luxurious. Spending hours soaking and chatting looked less like civic duty and more like self-indulgence. For men raised on stories of stern ancestors and battlefield toughness, this comfort felt unearned. Excess showed itself in subtle ways. Some bathers visited multiple times a day. Others treated the baths as an extension of their dining rooms, snacking, drinking, and lingering long after the practical need to wash had passed. Expensive oils and perfumes turned cleanliness into competition. The baths became places to show off leisure, not efficiency. Moral panic also followed the mingling of bodies. Even when baths were segregated by gender or time, rumours persisted of improper encounters, blurred boundaries, and declining modesty. The very fact that nakedness was normalised unsettled those who believed social order depended on strict separation and visible restraint. Writers and satirists seized on these fears. They mocked bathgoers as weak, vain, and addicted to comfort. The baths were portrayed as places where serious men wasted time and serious values dissolved in steam. Yet the satire rarely slowed attendance. If anything, it confirmed how central the baths had become. What truly alarmed critics was not dirt or disease, but distraction. Time spent bathing was time not spent working, training, or serving the state. The baths offered pleasure without productivity, and that challenged Rome's self-image as a society built on discipline. Still, attempts to shame or restrict bath culture failed. The baths endured because they met real needs: social, psychological, and emotional. They soothed stress in an unforgiving city. They offered routine in a chaotic world. In the end, moral panic revealed anxiety rather than decay. The baths did not corrupt Rome. They exposed the tension between Rome's ideals and its realities, between discipline and desire, restraint and comfort. And in that warm, echoing space, Romans chose comfort far more often than they cared to admit. When Rome declined, the baths were among the first institutions to fall silent. Not because Romans suddenly stopped valuing cleanliness or social life, but because the fragile systems that kept the baths alive began to fail. Aqueducts cracked, maintenance slowed, fuel grew scarce. The warm water that once flowed effortlessly through the city became unreliable, then absent. And without water, the heart of Roman daily life stopped beating. The disappearance of the baths marked more than the loss of a luxury. It marked the collapse of a social rhythm that had structured Roman identity for centuries. Without the baths, people no longer gathered daily in shared vulnerability. Gossip fragmented, politics retreated into closed spaces, social classes hardened again, no longer softened by routine contact. Rome became quieter and more divided. This silence was not immediately noticed. At first, smaller baths closed. Then hours were reduced. Then entire complexes fell into disuse. Marble cracked, pools dried. Statues were looted or repurposed. What had once been living architecture turned into hollow shells, monuments to a way of life that no longer functioned. Later generations would look back with disbelief. How could a civilization that built such wonders lose them? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. The baths required cooperation. They depended on shared resources, shared effort, and shared trust. When those collapsed, no amount of stone or engineering could replace them. The loss of the baths reshaped daily life profoundly. Washing became private again, if it happened at all. Social interaction narrowed. Public space shrank. The city lost one of its few places where rich and poor still crossed paths regularly. Hygiene suffered, yes, but so did community. Ironically, Roman baths survived longer as ruins than they did as functioning spaces. Medieval travellers wandered through them, marvelling at their scale while misunderstanding their purpose. The baths were remembered as symbols of excess or decadence, not as engines of cohesion, but the truth is simpler. Roman baths worked because Rome worked. They were not the cause of Roman strength, but a reflection of it. When trust, infrastructure, and shared identity eroded, the baths could not survive. And when the water stopped flowing, Rome did not just lose a place to wash. It lost a daily reminder that civilization is something you must maintain, together, or watch slowly go cold. In the medieval world, information did not travel quietly. It had to be spoken, projected, and remembered. Most people could not read, written notices were limited, and news moved at the speed of a horse. In this environment, the herald was not a decorative figure with a trumpet. He was infrastructure. When a herald spoke, authority spoke. His voice carried law, war, and legitimacy into streets, castles, and battlefields. Heralds existed because medieval society depended on public recognition. A decree only mattered if people heard it. A truce only worked if both sides acknowledged it. A battle only truly began once it was declared. Heralds provided that acknowledgement. They did not persuade or debate. They announced. And once announced, the message became real. This gave heralds an unusual kind of power. They were protected figures, often granted safe conduct even between enemies. Killing a herald was not bravery, it was a crime against order itself. To harm one was to reject negotiation, to declare chaos preferable to rules. Even brutal war cultures understood this boundary. The messenger had to survive, or nothing else worked. Heralds were trusted because they were meant to be neutral. They did not fight, they did not command troops, they did not negotiate outcomes on their own authority. Their role was precision, to say exactly what was given to them, no more and no less. In a world where rumour could spark bloodshed, accuracy was survival. Their appearance reinforced this role. Heralds wore distinctive clothing, marked with symbols of the lord or ruler they served. These colours and emblems acted like a uniform of legitimacy. You might hate the message, but you recognised the messenger. That recognition mattered more than popularity. On the battlefield, heralds stood between armies, sometimes alone, sometimes under a banner, reading declarations of war, terms of surrender, or challenges. These moments were not symbolic. They were procedural. A battle without declaration was dishonourable. A surrender without a herald could be ignored. Words created legal reality. In towns, heralds proclaimed laws, executions, taxes, festivals, and royal births. Their announcements structured time itself, reminding people what mattered and when. Silence from a herald could be as significant as speech. In a loud, violent, and fragmented world, heralds provided something rare, a shared understanding. They were not powerful because they shouted. They were powerful because everyone agreed to listen. Heralds were not chosen for strength, bravery, or noble birth. They were chosen for something far rarer in the medieval world: reliable memory. In an age where records were scattered, inconsistent, or non-existent, a trained mind was more valuable than a strong arm. The herald's primary weapon was recall, precise, exhaustive, and disciplined. From early in their training, heralds were immersed in genealogy. They memorized family lines, marriages, titles, claims, and feuds stretching back generations. This was not trivia. In a society where inheritance determined power, knowing who had the legitimate right to land, banners, or command could prevent wars or justify them. A herald who made a mistake could spark violence. Heralds also studied coats of arms with obsessive detail. Colours, animals, symbols, and patterns mattered deeply. A lion facing left was not the same as one facing right. A stripe, a border, or a slight change in colour could distinguish one family from another. On a battlefield crowded with armoured men, these symbols were how allies were recognised and enemies identified. Misidentification could be fatal. This knowledge was tested constantly. Heralds were expected to identify knights in tournaments, list noble lineages accurately, and resolve disputes over precedence. Who stood closer to the king? Who entered first? Who had the right to bear certain arms? These arguments were not petty, they were political. Status was everything, and heralds enforced its rules. Unlike scribes, heralds carried this information into the field. Their memory had to function under pressure, noise, and danger. They could not consult books. They had to know. And they had to speak with confidence, because hesitation invited challenge. Training emphasized precision over creativity. Heralds did not improvise. They learned formulas, protocols, and exact phrasing. A declaration had to be delivered correctly, or it could be dismissed. Words were tools, and tools had to fit exactly. What made heralds exceptional was not intelligence alone, but discipline. They submitted their memory to structure. They became walking archives, trusted because they were consistent. In a medieval world where chaos was common and records fragile, heralds proved that knowledge, when carefully preserved and publicly recognized, could hold society together just as firmly as walls or weapons. When armies faced each other in the medieval world, violence did not begin immediately. First came words, and those words belonged to the herald. Before swords were drawn, a herald stepped forward, often alone, carrying nothing but a staff, a banner, or a trumpet. His presence signalled that what followed would be governed by rules, even if those rules ended in blood. Heralds announced declarations of war, challenges, and ultimatums. These were not ceremonial flourishes. A battle without formal declaration could be considered unlawful or dishonourable, weakening claims of victory and complicating ransom, prisoner treatment, and future negotiations. The herald's voice created legal clarity in chaos. They also negotiated from the edge of danger. Heralds delivered terms of surrender, requests for parley, and offers of truce. They did not decide these terms, but their delivery mattered. Tone, accuracy, and timing could determine whether an offer was accepted or rejected. A poorly delivered message could turn hesitation into slaughter. Remarkably, heralds were usually respected by both sides. They travelled between camps under protections that functioned like early diplomatic immunity. Harming a herald marked a commander as reckless and untrustworthy. Future negotiations would suffer. Even brutal leaders understood that killing the messenger poisoned future outcomes. Heralds also served as battlefield observers. They identified combatants, recorded deeds of valour, and took note of who fought honourably. These observations mattered later. Ransoms, rewards, promotions, and reputations depended on them. A knight who performed bravely but went unrecognised lost status. A herald ensured memory survived the fog of war. After battles, heralds helped count the dead, identify noble bodies, and arrange ransoms. Warfare was expensive, and ransom was a major economic system. Knowing who was captured, who survived, and who fell was not sentimental. It was financial and political. Heralds provided this accounting. They stood close enough to violence to smell it, but far enough to remain untouched. Their role required courage of a different kind, the courage to trust that both sides valued order more than impulse. In a world defined by force, heralds represented restraint. They proved that even in war, words mattered, and that without someone to speak them correctly, violence lost its meaning and its limits. Away from the battlefield, heralds were just as busy, and just as influential. Medieval tournaments were not simple entertainment. They were public auditions for honour, reputation, and political favour. And at the centre of these carefully staged events stood the herald, turning chaotic clashes into structured meaning. Tournaments gathered nobles from across regions. Knights arrived displaying their arms, colours, and lineage. Without heralds, this visual language would have been meaningless. Heralds identified competitors, announced their names, titles, and ancestry, and ensured that everyone present understood exactly who was being watched. Recognition transformed violence into spectacle. Honour in the medieval world depended on witnesses. A brave act unseen might as well not have happened. Heralds ensured that deeds were recorded, remembered, and spoken aloud. When a knight struck well, unhorsed an opponent, or showed mercy, a herald noted it. Later, these moments shaped reputation, marriage prospects, patronage, and legacy. Heralds also enforced rules. They ensured that competitors fought under agreed conditions, respected boundaries, and followed ritualized conduct. Violations were announced publicly. Disqualification was humiliation. In a culture obsessed with honour, being called out by a herald could stain a name for years. Lineage mattered deeply in tournaments. Heralds verified claims of nobility, preventing impostors from gaining unearned status. If a man could not prove his right to bear arms, he could be barred. This gatekeeping protected the social hierarchy while giving it a veneer of fairness. Spectators trusted heralds to interpret what they saw. Few understood heraldic symbols or distant family histories. Heralds translated visual chaos into narrative. They explained rivalries, highlighted feuds, and framed outcomes. In doing so, they shaped how events were remembered. Tournaments were rehearsals for war, but they were also performances for peace. They allowed aggression to be expressed within limits, ambition to be displayed safely, and reputations to rise without bloodshed. Heralds made this possible by turning individual actions into shared understanding. In this role, heralds became guardians of public memory. Long after the dust settled, it was their words that survived, spoken again and again until a man's name became inseparable from his deeds. Beyond battlefields and tournaments, Heralds operated in the narrow space where violence might still be avoided. They were among the few people trusted to move freely between hostile powers, carrying words instead of weapons. In a medieval world where misunderstandings could ignite wars, this role made heralds indispensable. Heralds delivered ultimatums, truces, marriage proposals, ransom negotiations, and peace terms. These were not casual messages. Each word had legal weight. A phrase spoken incorrectly could be interpreted as an insult, a threat, or an admission of weakness. Heralds therefore learned restraint. They spoke clearly, formally, and without personal emotion. Their authority came from neutrality. Safe conduct was essential. A herald travelling under protection represented a shared belief that rules still mattered, even between enemies. Attacking one was more than a crime. It signalled that negotiation was finished. Once that line was crossed, war became harder to stop. For this reason, even bitter rivals usually respected heralds, knowing they might need them tomorrow. Heralds also acted as buffers. They absorbed tension that might otherwise erupt. By delivering demands face to face, they humanized conflict just enough to keep it manageable. A written message could be ignored or misread. A herald could clarify intent immediately, preventing escalation born of confusion. In surrender negotiations, heralds played a critical role. They announced terms publicly, ensuring both sides understood what had been agreed. This transparency mattered. It protected soldiers from betrayal and commanders from later accusations. Once a herald spoke the terms aloud, breaking them became dishonourable. Heralds were also witnesses. They remembered what was promised, when and by whom. Their testimony could later justify claims, enforce ransoms, or expose bad faith. In disputes where no neutral court existed, memory became evidence. What made heralds effective diplomats was not persuasion, but credibility. They were not trying to win arguments. They were ensuring that arguments happened within rules. Their presence reminded everyone involved that conflict still existed inside a shared framework of custom and honour. In a time defined by personal power and shifting alliances, heralds provided continuity. They proved that even enemies needed common language, and that without someone trained to speak it precisely, peace would collapse as easily as war began. In medieval society, status was not abstract. It was physical, visible, and constantly contested. Who stood closest to the king? Who entered a hall first? Who sat higher at the table? These details mattered deeply. And when disputes arose, heralds were often the ones expected to decide. Not because they were powerful, but because they were trusted to remember exactly who outranked whom. Heralds acted as living reference systems for precedence. They knew which titles carried more weight, which families were older, and which alliances mattered most in a given context. Rank was not universal. It shifted depending on region, ceremony, and circumstance. A count might outrank a bishop in one setting and bow to him in another. Navigating these nuances required expertise, not guesswork. Disputes over precedence were dangerous. An insult to rank could spark feuds, duels, or even rebellions. Being placed too low in a procession suggested weakness. Being placed too high implied arrogance. Heralds diffused these tensions by grounding decisions in tradition rather than opinion. This is how it has always been done, was a powerful shield. Ceremonies relied heavily on heralds for this reason. Coronations, marriages, funerals, and treaties required careful choreography. Every placement communicated legitimacy. Heralds ensured that symbols, seating, and order aligned with accepted hierarchy. A single mistake could undermine the entire event. This authority extended beyond the elite. Town councils, guilds, and military units also relied on heraldic judgment to organize parades, musters, and public rituals. Heralds helped translate noble hierarchy into civic order, reinforcing the idea that society itself had a correct arrangement. Importantly, heralds were not arbiters of justice in a moral sense. They did not decide who deserved rank, only who had it. Their role was descriptive, not reformist. That limitation made them useful. They preserved stability by reinforcing existing structures rather than questioning them. Because of this, heralds were sometimes resented. Their decisions could disappoint ambitious men or confirm uncomfortable truths. But challenging a herald meant challenging tradition itself, which few were willing to do openly. In a world where identity was inseparable from position, heralds served as custodians of social geometry. They kept society aligned, not by force, but by memory, ensuring everyone knew exactly where they stood and how far they could safely move. Medieval society relied heavily on memory, but memory was fragile. Battles blurred together, witnesses disagreed, victors exaggerated, losers vanished. Heralds existed to impose structure on this chaos. They recorded who fought, who fell, who fled, and who distinguished themselves. In doing so, they shaped reputation, often permanently. After battles and tournaments, heralds compiled accounts of events. These were not emotional narratives, they were functional records. Who captured whom? Who was taken for ransom? Who died honorably? Who broke formation? These details mattered because medieval warfare was as much legal and economic as it was violent. Ransom agreements, inheritance claims, and rewards depended on accurate reporting. A knight's future could hinge on a herald's testimony. Valor recognized could lead to patronage, land, or marriage. Valor forgotten might as well not have happened. Heralds decided what entered collective memory and what dissolved into silence. This gave them quiet influence over social mobility within the nobility. Deaths were especially sensitive. Identifying noble bodies after battle was crucial. Families needed confirmation. Lords needed proof. Without a herald's word, disputes over survival could linger for years. A man rumoured dead might lose his lands prematurely. A man falsely declared alive could delay succession dangerously. Heralds reduced uncertainty by acting as official witnesses. They also preserved shame. Cowardice, desertion, or dishonourable conduct could follow a man long after the event. Heralds did not editorialise, but facts alone were enough. A name listed among those who fled spoke volumes. Reputation in medieval society was cumulative, and heraldic records ensured that nothing was forgotten. Importantly, heralds were expected to remain impartial. Favouritism undermined trust. A biased herald was worse than useless. He was dangerous. For this reason, experienced heralds guarded their credibility carefully. Their authority depended entirely on belief in their accuracy. Over time, these records formed the backbone of noble identity. Families traced honour through heraldic memory, citing deeds recorded decades earlier. Lineage was not just blood. It was documented behaviour. In this way, heralds became custodians of legacy. They did not wield swords or command armies, but they determined how violence was remembered. And in a world where memory defined worth, that role was power of the quietest and most enduring kind. For all their authority and respect, medieval heralds lived with constant risk. Their safety depended entirely on a shared agreement that rules still mattered. As long as both sides valued order, the herald was protected. The moment that agreement cracked, the herald became vulnerable. Neutrality was their greatest asset, and their greatest burden. Heralds were expected to serve power without belonging to it. They spoke for kings and lords, yet were not knights. They moved among nobles, yet were not noble themselves in most cases. This in-between status gave them access, but it also meant they stood alone. If something went wrong, they had little protection beyond reputation. Travel itself was dangerous. Heralds crossed battle zones, hostile territories, and unstable borders carrying messages that might anger the listener. They could arrive bearing demands for surrender, declarations of war, or news of defeat. Any of these could provoke violence. A furious lord might be tempted to silence the messenger rather than accept the message, yet restraint usually prevailed, not out of kindness, but calculation. Killing a herald sent a message to the world that negotiation was impossible. It warned future envoys to stay away. That isolation could be fatal in the long run. Even ruthless rulers understood that burning bridges limited options. Still, not all heralds were spared. During especially brutal conflicts, rules collapsed. Safe conduct was ignored. Heralds were detained, threatened, or used as leverage. These moments marked the breakdown of medieval diplomatic culture, points where violence no longer needed justification. Heralds also faced subtler dangers. Being trusted by everyone meant being watched by everyone. A whisper of bias could destroy a career. Favouring one lord too openly, misreporting an event or delivering a message poorly could end a herald's usefulness. Once trust eroded, protection vanished with it. Despite this, many heralds served for decades. They survived because they understood restraint. They did not embellish. They did not argue. They delivered words exactly as given and withdrew. Their professionalism was survival strategy. The cost of this neutrality was personal invisibility. Heralds shaped history, yet rarely became its heroes. Their names faded while the deeds they recorded endured. In a violent age obsessed with honour, heralds represented something fragile but vital: trust without force. And as long as that trust held, words could still cross battle lines, keeping war just restrained enough to remain human. By the late medieval period, the world that had made heralds essential began to change. Literacy expanded, written records multiplied, bureaucracies grew heavier and more permanent. Kings relied less on memory, carried in human form, and more on documents sealed, copied, and archived. Slowly, the herald's role shifted, not because it failed, but because society no longer depended on it in the same way. Yet the decline of the herald was not sudden. For a long time, old and new systems overlapped. Heralds still announced wars, verified arms, and presided over ceremony, but their authority was increasingly shared with clerks, lawyers, and administrators. What had once required a trusted voice now required a stamped page. Power became quieter, slower, and less personal. This transition revealed something important about the medieval herald's true function. Heralds had never merely carried information. They had carried consensus. Their authority rested on shared belief in honour, custom, and the idea that words spoken correctly could bind people as firmly as chains. When that belief weakened, the herald's protection weakened with it. As warfare grew larger and more impersonal, heralds became harder to protect. Mass armies cared less for ritual. Ideological conflicts cared less for negotiation. When war stopped being about lords settling disputes and became about states asserting dominance, the neutral messenger lost ground. Rules mattered less when victory mattered more. Still, heralds left a deep imprint. Modern diplomacy, military protocol, and international law all echo their logic. Flags of truce, protected envoys, formal declarations — these ideas did not emerge from kindness. They emerged from the medieval understanding that without agreed messengers, conflict spirals into annihilation. Even today, the herald's legacy survives in ceremony. Announcements, titles, coats of arms, and state rituals all trace back to that medieval need for public recognition. We still believe that authority must be declared to exist, that power, to be real, must be seen and heard. The medieval herald was never the loudest figure in history. He stood between shouting armies and spoke calmly. He remembered when others forgot. He enforced rules when violence tempted men to abandon them. When the herald fell silent, the world did not become more peaceful, only more efficient at conflict. And that may be the herald's final lesson. That civilization is not defined by how loudly power speaks, but by whether anyone is still trusted to speak for it at all.